When TCU head football coach Sonny Dykes said he wanted to make history, I don't quite think this is what he had in mind. Unfortunately, however, for Dykes and the Horned Frogs, they were on the wrong side of history yesterday in the College Football National Championship game in Inglewood, California, suffering an embarrassing 65-7 loss at the hands of Georgia. The 65 points were the most ever given up in a college football championship game on the Division I/FBS level, and the 58-point beatdown was the largest margin of victory in the aforementioned game. Both circumstances, they topped the 1996 Nebraska Cornhuskers drubbing of Florida in the Fiesta Bowl. Nebraska had previously held that mark with 62 points and a 38-point drubbing. So that ought to give you an idea how big of an ass-kicking this was. Nebraska held that record of 38-point deficit for 25 years, 26 years. Georgia just came around and topped that by almost 3 touchdowns, and we will not see a drubbing this big ever again, in my opinion. This was just a complete one-sided ass-whooping from opening kickoff to the final, seconds ticking off the clock. Ever since this game kicked off, and it quickly became apparent that this was going to be a one-sided beating, the pundits, the experts, the armchair quarterbacks on social media, everybody and their mother has come out and said the same regurgitated bullshit. That the committee got it wrong by having TCU in there to begin with. See, this should have been someone else. Yada, yada, yada. But I pose this question to you, in all defense of TCU here. If you don't think TCU belonged, did Michigan? Because last I checked, I have not heard one word, one complaint, one even eyebrow raise emoji have I seen questioning Michigan's spot when the 4 teams were announced. They and Georgia, nobody had a problem with. TCU, 7 days ago, went into Glendale, Arizona in the Fiesta Bowl, hung 51 on a very, very good defense, and beat them in a game that they really led from start to finish. Never was in doubt. I'm not going to come on here and say that TCU gave it their all. I'm not going to polish a turd. They went out there and shit the bed. They got their ass kicked. The score speaks for itself. The records speak for themselves. This was an embarrassing end to a Cinderella story. That was. And unfortunately, happily ever after does not exist. Certainly, very rarely does in sports. There's always an end to a story that's not always the best. Okay? TCU is no different. Difference between them and the other Cinderella runs that we've seen in sports is Georgia took that clock off the wall before it struck midnight and repeatedly smashed it over TCU's head. I mean, we've seen Cinderella stories. We've seen, Butler back in the 2010s, beginning of the decade, go on, that miracle run to the national title game where they lost in a buzzer beater shot that nearly won in by Gordon Hayward, which would have won the game. This was completely opposite of that. TCU got smeared. No nice way to put it, but does that mean they did not deserve to be there? Horseshit. They did. They did, and they proved it when they beat Michigan in the Fiesta Bowl. The funny thing to me is the loudest pundits against this and the ones most outspoken, to the shock of nobody, are people in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Alabama fans. As if Bama hasn't had a few questionable spots in the playoffs themselves over the years. Now, granted, Alabama went in there and held their own. I'll give them full credit. Those playoff spots that they got, they mostly showed they belonged. But can you say again that TCU did in this game, notwithstanding? You don't beat a Michigan team that good if you don't belong. I'm sorry. And once again, apologies to Alabama fan, you lost twice. You had your chance. You didn't even make the conference championship game. Now, TCU lost in theirs. I get it. TCU lost in theirs to a team that Alabama kicked the shit out of. I get it. But if anybody has a complaint here, it's Tennessee, because Tennessee beat Alabama. They had the same record. So if anyone should be bitching, it's people in Knoxville. Yet they've been noticeably quiet. Why? Because they're willing to understand and settle. Their time is coming. They don't have a sense of entitlement, by and large. And I never thought they'd say that about Tennessee after they ran Greg Schiano out of town. But they've kept their fucking mouth shut. They worried about the game they had. They beat a good Clemson team who's been, was one of the teams in the last 10 years. And they're preparing for next year. They're not worried about what they felt they were or what owed. Now, let's wrap this up in a nutshell. For TCU, this wasn't the end they wanted. Even a competitive loss would have been something to hang their hat on. This sucked. There's no nice way of saying it. This was embarrassing. But it doesn't take away from the run they've had. This will be a season, final game notwithstanding, that I think TCU fans will be talking about for a long, long time. And it was a hell of a turnaround. 14 months ago, when this program pushed the greatest coach in school's football history, Gary Patterson, a guy who has a statue built outside the stadium after him, and when it's all said and done, will probably have a part of the stadium named after him. When they pushed him out the door on Halloween Day, did you guys think this was going to happen this year? When they brought in Sonny Dykes, who once upon a time flamed out at California in the Pac-12, Pac-10 I guess it was at the time, I think they suspected he would do fine there. He did a great job at SMU. He did as good of a job as you're going to do at SMU. I suspected they felt he was going to do well. I don't think they thought he was going to do this well this quickly. Lead them to a national title game in his first year. There's hope springs eternal. Believe me, this is a building block. And suddenly TCU is developing themselves into a hell of a program. This was the next step. And this is a school that's had a lot of success over the last 20 years, mainly under Patterson. But now Dykes is carrying on that tradition. But look, you've got names like LaDainian Tomlinson that are TCU guys. Andy Dalton, again, that's not exactly somebody to, world beater. We're not talking Peyton Manning here. But these are guys that can go into living rooms and say, hey, I played for TCU. This is what they're capable of. Now they're in the Big 12, and I don't think they're long for that. There's rumor and speculation and innuendo that the Big 10 has their eyes all over TCU. And what a game changer that would be for the program. So this is not the TCU of the 80s and 90s before Dennis Franchione took over and laid the groundwork and then left for Alabama, and Patterson took it from there. This isn't a team that'll make a bowl game once every 10 years in the Blue Bonnet Bowl with a 6 record. This is a team that's built to sustain, and I think this was the next step. It was a painful next step, but sometimes the most valuable learning lessons are the most painful ones. As for Georgia, look, kudos, man. This team is dominant. What Kirby Smart has done in Athens, taking over for Mark Richt and taking them to the next step, is a sight to behold. They're a dynasty. They are not going away. And I'm glad for them. They run a clean program. They run generally a modest program. There's not a lot of entitlement and cockiness that goes on in Athens, Georgia, like we see at some of these other programs. I've always had fond views of the Georgia Bulldog program. I am happy for them. And Stetson Bennett, what more can I say about that guy? I'll be the first to admit I was online yesterday on Facebook making 1,001 age jokes about the guy, that he played football with Jesus Christ, he was in the Crusades, that TCU fans shouldn't be too upset because, you can say you lost to a quarterback that fought in the Alamo, that he was roommates with John Heisman, so he didn't need the Heisman Trophy, that he collects AARP. I mean, I could probably made 100 jokes about Stetson Bennett's age, which is ironic because he's almost 20 years younger than I am. He's 5 years older than my oldest child. So it was all in fun games because God knows the game wasn't too entertaining. How can you not like the guy's story, though? Went to Georgia as a walk-on, was driving an Uber to pay for his college, wound up, going to a community college for a couple of years when Justin Fields came on tow, wound up coming back to Georgia, no ego at all. And believe me, when you get bumped from a school, there's a lot of ego involved. Trust me on that. This guy had no ego. Came back to Georgia as a backup, shut his fucking mouth, learned under the learning tree of Jake Fromm and the others, and last year beat out a top 3 recruit in his recruiting class. That recruiting class of 2017 had 3 quarterbacks that were considered creme de la creme. It was Justin Fields, the aforementioned Fields, Trevor Lawrence, and JT Daniels. He wound up beating out JT Daniels for the job and winning the first national title that the school had seen since the early 80s when Herschel Walker was in town. Beat Alabama to win it. That's going to be talked about in Georgia lore forever. Then this year, he leads them to an unbeaten season, one of the best seasons in college football recent history. I'm not going to say it's better than LSU from a couple of years ago because it wasn't. But it was a hell of a season. This team was the top dog, no pun intended, from start to finish. And Stetson Barrett was the lead horse on offense behind it. Now that defense is loaded. But Bennett, this isn't your Nick Saban level quarterback that once upon a time was just there to hold the clipboard. Blake Sims, and the other ones, the McElroy. The list goes on and on before Hurts, Tagovailoa, and Young came around. He did his part to help this team win games, win big. He certainly did last night. So, from a guy that was driving an Uber that had no ego at all when he came back to Georgia after, going to community college for a couple years, to becoming a legend of Georgia football, could not happen to a better story, could not happen to a better person. This is probably the highlight of his career. I don't see him having much of one in the NFL. Granted, he's proved us wrong before, but he may wind up catching on as a backup. Who the hell knows? But if this is the highlight of his career, what a chapter. What a chapter in the book that he will forever hold. He did things that other quarterbacks in Georgia that have had great success in the NFL. Matthew Stafford could not lead Georgia to a national title. Stetson Bennett led him to 2. So my hat's off to the Bulldogs. My hat's off to Bennett. My hat's off to Kirby Smart. Runs a great program there in Athens. And my hat's off to TCU. You did belong. I don't give a shit what these pundits say. I don't give a shit what these armchair quarterbacks who are pissed off because their school didn't get in say. You proved it when you beat Michigan in the Fiesta Bowl. Anyway, that'll wrap it up. My name is JP, and just remember, you can't be victorious unless you're notorious. Good day.